I'm very happy to join again this wonderful conference. Thank you, Ivan, for inviting me. It will be boring because I will read my paper, but not totally boring because I will read only a selection of my paper. In his book, The Meaning of Life, Jean Grondin identifies four meanings of the word meaning when one deals with the problem of the meaning of life: direction, signification, reflection, and sensing or taste of life. The direction of life, that means the extension between birth and death, but also man's orientation to a fulfillment of his own life. In his early papers, Heidegger reflects on the concept of extension, Ausdehnung, between birth and death, a notion by which he rethinks Dilthey's notion of Lebenszusammenhang, usually translated by life nexus, but also by connectedness of life or context of life. But this context of life does not refer to a quantitative wholeness, but we could say to a qualitative one, essentially founded in Heidegger's early philosophy, in man's anticipation of death, therefore in the temporalizing of the future. This is what he defines as authenticity of the human being. The anticipation of the wholeness of life is in fact the link between authenticity and the quest for meaning, precisely if man gains a complete self-transparency. This could be completed only if man is at the origin of his own actions and words, if he can give himself his own purposes and finds himself his own beliefs. Grondin considers meaning as the main semiotic praxis that helps to interpret human life. As an animal that permanently expresses itself and interprets itself using Charles Taylor's words, man is in fact a hermeneutic animal, a being whose essence is to develop in every moment a self-interpretation and a self-understanding. This is the reason I will not discuss the problem of the conference directly, but as a hermeneutical problem. More exactly, I will discuss authenticity as the quest for hermeneutic truth, trying to argue that some late extensions of this concept lead not to more transparency of the human being, but to perversions of truth and to non-authenticity. In hermeneutics, the concept of truth appears when it is assigned the purpose of correctly interpreting obscurities. In a book from 1630, Donauer shows that if we interpret unclear passages correctly, we will be able to distinguish between their true and false meaning. Donauer points out that in order to identify the true meaning, we need to discover the author's intention. If there is only one correct meaning, the one intended by author, then only one interpretation is correct. The ideal of university has, of course, proved to be unattainable, having already been challenged by other hermeneutic projects of the time. In a work from 1742, Johann Martin Cladenius argues for a different theory, that of the point of view according to which understanding is perspectivist in nature. Depending on their circumstances, but also on their subjectivity, the participants in an event will understand it in completely different ways. The idea of hermeneutic truth is not abandoned in this approach, it acquires an obvious Leibnizian touch. Moreover, this program of hermeneutics also adopts the Cartesian ideal of rationality, particularly through Cladenius' idea of limiting the range of texts that are object of interpretation to rational texts only. The thesis of rationality is even further extended by Meyer, Georg Friedrich Meyer, referring not only to the text to be interpreted, but also to the activity of interpretation itself. Its principles must be purely rational, and most important is the principle of hermeneutic equity, according to which we must interpret a text as if the author were right. This assumption about truth finds its justification also in the proximity of Leibniz philosophy. The presupposition of Maya's hermeneutics can be seen as a form of semiotic Leibnizianism, according to which everything can be conceived as a word of science, not just linguistic ones, whose significations must be understood through an art of interpretation with precise rules. For this reason, hermeneutics is identified with the knowledge of all kinds of reality. The legibility of the world, therefore, depends on the thesis that all signs have God as their author, directly or indirectly, defined as the author's intention. Truth is achieved when the interpreter thinks exactly as the author thought. There is, therefore, a perfect analogy between the order of natural science and that of artificial science, according to this philosophical conviction, in spite of Cartesian criticism, the idea of resemblance not only survives, but once again becomes defining for the entire program of this new technique of interpretation, which combines hermeneutics and semiotics. However, the idea of analogy is completed by the idea that the divine author of science is the guarantor of all science and also of their truth. This idea, which is common to Cartesianism and Leibnizianism, increases the philosophical tension between the thesis of analogy, perspectivism, and the principle of sufficient reason. This tension is found in Baumgarten, Aesthetica, 1750. Unlike metaphysical truth, which is natural and objective, aesthetic truth is subjective. It is the truth of the ego's representation of metaphysical truth. It is the truth that is sensibly known through the affection of the ego. As the truth of representation, it consists in the correspondence of the representation to the object and is therefore logical truth. Since it is subjective, it can also be called spiritual truth. But in the strict sense, aesthetic truth, Baumgarten believes, refers to, I quote, the way in which metaphysical truth shows itself to the analogo of reason and the lower faculties of cognition. Baumgarten's attempt to give the sensible an autonomy is remarkable, even if it is by analogy and recognized as inferior to the other. The Enlightenment's belief in the rationality of text and interpretive activity favored the belief that the author's intention can be correctly identified because it is a conscious, controlled intention. The author knows with certainty what he wants to say. He has control over the meaning, but also over the expressions. Moreover, we should presuppose that there is a continuity between the moments or stages of creation, that it is a continuous process without great leaps or reversals. The initial point or the origin is continued through its effects without the risk of something unforeseen occurring, and the author manages not to deviate from the intended meaning. But with the hermeneutics of suspicion in the 19th century comes another understanding of creation. Nietzsche talks about the history of origins against the philosophical prejudice that everything can be explained by a single origin, which is what philosophers have always done by invoking the idea of principle. Therefore, in the act of creation, there are modifications, shifts of perspective, sometimes reversals, intuitions, and enlightenments along the way, which are totally different from the original intention. In other words, as Foucault points out, following in Nietzsche's footsteps, creation is already an interpretation, that is, a mastery of the pre-existing fields of forces. The author is no longer the absolute source of meaning, but it is constituted in this field of previous discourses and signifying practices. The death of the author, announced by Roland Barthes, is compared by Foucault to the death of God. The author's originality and authenticity are therefore no longer sources of discourses and texts. The problem of author's intention becomes outdated, said Foucault. What difference does it make who is speaking? After Michel Foucault, along with Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, new suspicions arises concerning science, in addition to those already present in Western culture. Language has always been suspected in two respects. Firstly, that it does not mean exactly what it says, but conceals a deep meaning. And secondly, that it goes beyond the verbal form of expression. The emergence of the hermeneutics of suspicion in the 19th century imposes a new type of interpretation that still defines us today. According to Foucault, the understanding of reality through the many notions which were emblematic of the old type of interpretation in the 16th century, convenientia, sympatheia, emulatio, signatura, analogia, was based on the conviction that the world consisted of a vast network of resemblances. Bacon and Descartes' criticism of the idea of resemblance contributed decisively to the disappearance of this type of interpretation. There is therefore a discontinuity between it and the new type of interpretation which emerged in the 19th century. However, history can also be written differently than Foucault did. Because the Cartesian program, critical of the idea of resemblance, ends up coexisting with the Leibnizian program, which revitalizes the idea of resemblance, which it rethinks as rational harmony. Their intertwining is emblematic of the definitions given of truth in the hermeneutical and aesthetic projects of the 16th and 18th centuries. Moreover, the first signs of a suspicious and detective-like attitude were already appearing at the time due to the discovery of the unconscious within the Enlightenment, an attitude that was nevertheless nuanced by the romantic reformulation of the unconscious. If we re-include the explicit hermeneutical projects of this period in the archive investigated by Foucault, the history of the shift from the episteme of resemblance to the hermeneutics of suspicion can also be written in a different way than Foucault did. The interpretive techniques rooted in the presupposition of similarity not only do not disappear after the 16th century as Foucault claims, but they find their most precise formulation in the treatises of hermeneutics and aesthetics of the following centuries, deeply influenced by Leibnizian monadology and the theory of pre-established harmony. In addition, the Enlightenment of these centuries is not unequivocal. Leibnizianism was predominant in hermeneutics and aesthetics, favoring a technique of interpretation that took reason as its indisputable model. But the first discoveries regarding the unconscious were already being made. According to Sloterdijk, the discovery of the unconscious dates back to the 18th century in the context of the Enlightenment. The theory of magnetism, the phenomenon of magnetic sleep, which in the following century would be called hypnosis. Foucault's reading notes prove that he was aware of these findings, even if he considers that the hermeneutics of suspicion only appeared with Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx. We could argue that these discoveries were reactions to the Enlightenment's illusion of the full transparency of consciousness. Such experiences highlighted the fact that behind consciousness and reason, there was something else, well hidden, that needed to be discovered, exposed, and analyzed. When Freud concluded that the hidden element could be discovered through the interpretation of dreams, he encountered and even overturned the old Cartesian tradition, which privileged the ability of the rational ego to prove self-certainty. The Enlightenment, as Sloterdijk points out, initially reacted to such a discovery, considered to be reactionary because it was seen as an attack on reason, as well as on the scientific knowledge of the world and of our own self. The initial reaction was, in fact, a misunderstanding on the part of the Enlightenment about their own presuppositions. For the expansion of knowledge into the new truth of the unconscious does not all contradict the illusion of full transparency, but postpones it, extended it into new territory and now promising greater transparency, even full knowledge. Those who believe that highlighting the unconscious is an attack on reason are under the impression that if it had not been discovered, it would not have existed. Obviously, the fanatical defenders of reason, as Nietzsche called them, believe the same about corporeality, fact, history, and so on. The hidden elements, the negativity with its shadows, in Sloterdijk's words, expand more and more as the self-reflexive inquiry becomes more efficient. The late effects of this scenario are deeply unsettling, for it becomes a chronic analysis of oneself and others. Therefore, a detective-like relation to reality thus arises, which requires a necessary second look at reality, suspecting that the first impression can only be misleading. It suspects the ego's claim to know itself directly by virtue of a hypothetical closeness to itself, discovering its inner distance from itself. There seems to be a continuity between the unconscious that had barely been discovered by the Enlightenment and its reformulations by the hermeneutics of suspicion. In both cases, the negative side of the unconscious, which is responsible for the shadows of the human being, is overvalued. However, the optimistic hypothesis regarding the unconscious present in Romanticism is interposed between the two moments. The hermeneutic and the aesthetic program of Romanticism make full use of this positive valence of unconscious, seen as the place in man where the divine is present, as man's chance to return to the divine whole from which he was torn. In Romanticism, hermeneutics and aesthetics are based on the idea that in order to understand the part, we must understand the whole. Schleiermacher, for instance. But this whole is no longer under the perfect control of the author, and the interpreter can understand even what remains unconscious to the author, and thus he understands him better than the author understood himself. Although the romantic invocation of this claim was intended to reintroduce the author and the reader into a benevolent world of science and interpretations, the discovery of the unconscious is again used from the 19th century onwards to support the bad nature of science, which led to the proliferation of the interpretive technique related to the hermeneutics of suspicion. A hallmark of the hermeneutics of suspicion, according to Foucault, is the refusal of the absolute beginning. The further we go into the interpretation, the more we reach the dangerous zone in which the interpretation returns to its starting point, disappearing as an interpretation. But at the same time, the interpreter himself disappears after Foucault. Let us test this idea, returning to the hermeneutic problem of the author's intention, in order to then, through it, question Foucault's thesis that suspicious interpretation refuses any beginning. By shifting the focus of interpretation from the object to the author, whom he understands as an interpreter of previous interpretations himself, Nietzsche changes the very direction of hermeneutics. The question, who is the one who says something, just like the question, who interprets, makes us discover both a field of forces, the indistinct murmur, as Foucault will call it when he notes the disappearance of the author, from which the subject, author, and the interpreter is formed, as well as a will to meaning, what we call the author's intention, which is the very will to power that brings order to the field of power. It is not absolutely prime, but results from the very field of forces in which the subject is formed. In Nietzsche, then, two kinds of origins combine to produce an effect. The plural but indistinct field of forces and the ordering force, the will to power that gives becoming its own meaning. Within this new interpretive paradigm, creation always starts from somewhere, from the middle of a scene of pre-existing interpretations, from the layers of meaning that do not have a prior order, as in the Enlightenment aesthetic hermeneutic scenario that followed Leibniz, which rather form a chaos or even have the constraining character of prejudices or cliches from which the author or artist tries to free himself. Thus, creation also involves a moment of decision, but not an initial one, rather a late one. The hermeneutics of suspicion has an ambiguous attitude towards the question of the beginning. By rejecting the absolute beginning of interpretation and betting on the infinity of interpretations, this technique reintroduces an idea of the beginning and of the end of interpretation. In different ways, Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx each make a meta-discursive hermeneutic decision when they establish the level of meaning at which interpretation finds the meaning it seeks. The field of corporeality in Nietzsche, the one of sexual drives in Freud, and that of economic needs in Marx. By absolutizing a particular structure, the only one that really produces meaning, Freud and Marx claim that their approach is purely scientific, unlike any other perspective. Everything else is ideology, Marx claims. Apparently more temperate, Nietzsche proposes a complete redefinition of the idea of science, which becomes for him a Gaia Scienza, with an existential purpose aimed at modifying the interpreter. Foucault is right when he states that the emergence of the suspicious attitude in the practice of interpretation is equivalent to a separation of hermeneutics from semiotics. Hermeneutics relies on the violence and the infinity of interpretations, while semiotics believes in the absolute existence of science, limiting the circularity of interpretations. However, the claim to scientificity of the hermeneutics of suspicion, particularly present in Freud and Marx, profoundly sabotages the very hermeneutic nature of the new interpretive technique. The hermeneutics of suspicion criticizes the belief in the fixity of science, but it reintroduces semiotics into the very structure of interpretation. Interpretation has an ultimate layer on which meaning is sought, an infrastructure that is assumed from the beginning as the basis of interpretation, without being brought to phenomenological evidence and to criticism. The drive layer of the unconscious in Freud, the economic infrastructure in Marx, and to a lesser extent the field of corporeality in Nietzsche are mere presuppositions about meaning. Once assumed, these layers of meaning are used to reductionistically explain extremely diverse phenomena, from psychic, life, and intersubjective relations to religious and aesthetic experience. The hermeneutics of suspicion is thus at war with semiotics only by adopting it in its own approach. approach. Nowadays, the generalized suspicion of any received truth, of everything that seems to be stable, the detective-like temptation to discover new and new layers of meaning, layers claiming to be the ultimate, the only authentic source of truth, resembles a war machine in which the demystifications of the past are replaced by new mystifications. Apparently liberating, the ideology of radical newness, having its sources in modernity, can prove to be as totalitarian as the closed, ready-made ideological configurations. The critique of the old truths, proven to be mere illusions, is made in the name of new illusions that claim to be truths. Suspicion seems to have become the watchword of the strange manner in which truth is sought in our age. Beneficial in the form of criticism, see Paul Ricoeur, for instance, and especially of self-criticism, the technique of suspicion sometimes takes extreme, even monstrous forms, attacking any chance of discovering the truth, any trace of social cohesion, of pre-established agreement, of collective memory or shared tradition, useful for the dismantling of the narratives of power imposed under the guise of alleged truth through manipulation, terror, and ideology, Arendt, among others, but also through institutions, social practices, and discourses, Foucault. Generalized suspicion can itself become a mythological mechanism for fabricating new narratives to serve certain interests. A veritable camera obscura, this fabulating machine presents its products as rigorously scientific or even metaphysically original, without preserving the criterion of rationality. The current hypostasis of hermeneutics of suspicion probably feed on the Enlightenment's lack of appetite for mystery and the utopia of complete knowledge. Equated with a false liberating ideal, this utopia increasingly becomes a rudimentary grid for interpreting the world, our own self and others, against the suspicious overbeaming of these supposedly shadowy but actually invented layers of meaning. We should once again acknowledge that we will never know everything about ourselves. Hermeneutic truth is not about the utopia of complete transparency, but is achieved through dialogue with our own history. Therefore, it is not reached through neurotic battles with the shadows of the self, but through the calm acceptance of its mystery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor BONDOR.